Okay, good morning. So continuing along the journey down the Sefiros, last week and the 2 weeks before, and the last 2 weeks I covered Sefiros. So the triangle of the three Chesed, Gvura, Sefiros, Yamin, Smail, Emtza. So now comes the next stage of the Sefiros, which is namely Netzach, but Netzach Chassidus, are essentially the next triangle. So in the structure where it's three kavim, instead of the Sefiros Zeh Tachas Zeh, Netzach is Kavi Yamin, Tachas HaChesed, and Gvura and Heid is Tzad HaSmail, under Gvura, and Yesod will be in the center, corresponding to under Das. So, but a few introductions as we go into this next stage of the Sefiros. You know, we learn a lot about Chesed, Gvura, Sefiros, much more discussion about them than about Netzach, Yesod. And as far as Midas Adam go, which we'll discuss later, that's pretty clear. Netzach means something different than Chesed does, just as Heid means something different than Gvura. But there's also a categorization where the three lower Midas, meaning Netzach, Yesod, are actually subsets of Chesed, Gvura, Sefiros. For example, let me just see in Tanya, in Perek Gimel, when the Alter Rebbe begins to talk about the Keiches of the Nefesh Elokis, so he divides it into 3 and 7. The 3 being Chabad, and then come the Midas, which are Teldus Chabad. And there he talks about Chesed, Gvura, and Sefiros, I believe. Does he talk about Sefiros? I don't remember now. Well, Chesed and Gvura for sure, Yira and Ave and Yira. But he doesn't spell out the Kitzur, the other 3. Netzach, Heid, and Yesod. So the general pshat, why is that the case? Because Chesed and Gvura Sefiros, especially Chesed and Gvura, are the klolas dika, like he says at the end. Chesed and Gvura, Ave v'amfer v'yira v'amfer. Because Chesed and Gvura capture, as we discussed, the 2 main kavim, that from that everything else emerges, including Netzach, Heid, Yesod. So I'd like to begin with reading a piece from Tanya in Ageres HaKedesh Siman Tezvav, which actually should also go and fit into last week's class and the previous ones, because this is the only place in Tanya, and maybe the only places in Chassidus in general, where all the Sefiros are spelled out in detail as they are Midas Adam. Matter of fact, when I did my book on Sefiros Eimer, the spiritual guide to counting the Eimer, where I went through Chesed Sheba Chesed all the way to Malchus Sheba Malchus, so this Ageres HaKedesh is very Yesodistic because the Alter Rebbe spells it out himself to an extent. So I just wanted to go back to that, even though maybe we should have read it earlier. But in Ageres HaKedesh Siman Tezvav, in the second paragraph, the Alter Rebbe says the following. I'm just going to go through it quickly, and I'll lead it into Netzach and Heid. That's really what a real emphasis here. So he says like this, so clearly he's talking about the 10 spheres as they are in Nishmas Adam, like he said in Perek Gimel, that the Keiches HaNefesh are nishtalshlu mehem. He says, Es keneged es spheres al yenish nishtalshlu mehem, that the Keiches HaNefesh are nishtalshlu from the 10 spheres, and we've been discussing as they are divine attributes, meaning midas al yenis, but they're also human attributes, because we're created b'tzelem elikim. So Alter Rebbe says, in a close Yusuf Benishmas Adam Neder Lekeil, Shamidas nechlok is b'derech klal l'zayin midas, v'chol protei midas shebodem boyes ma'achas mezayin midas elu. So it makes it very clear that the midas in general break down into a spectrum of 7, and all the detailed emotions, everything that a human being experiences is a component of, comes from one of these 7. So there's no human experience that is not included from Chesed through Malchus. They're the root of all midas and their general context. Shehein midas ha-chesed, Here the Alter Rebbe teaches. So we already went through this, but it's good to see it inside. Lashpia, how does he teach chesed? Lashpia bli gvul. Mashpia bli gvul. So the context, the way the Alter Rebbe puts it all is in hashpah. Because midas obviously is a relationship, as we've discussed. Moichin is not a relationship. Moichin is la'atzmei. As a matter of fact, the ultimate intellectual experience is when you're sitting alone. Chaverim and have pilpul chaverim, etc. that sharpens it. Really, if you want to concentrate in something, it's alone is so. Midas is not possible without another, because it's all about a relationship. So the Alter Rebbe actually indeed says, so he's going to explain the midas in the context of a relationship. What is chesed? It's essentially the power to transmit. Gvura, midas gvura letzamtzem el hashpia kol kach. Oy shaloi lashpia. So gvura, antithesis chesed, as we discussed, to concentrate or to somewhat direct and or to choose lashpia together. It's also part of Gvura. Midas harachmim, which we discussed last week and 2 weeks ago. Midas harachmim, rachim al misha shayach lo shenachmonos alav. V'hi midah u'mitzaz ben Gvura l'chesed. That's in between Gvura and Chesed, like we discussed. Like mumutza between them. Shehi lashpia l'chol l'misha shayach lo shenachmonos alav. So very tight as Chesed. Actually, differently, if you may recall when I spoke about the Mayim and Toshin Tess, their Sachmonis is even when a person doesn't deserve Chesed, because what is challenging it, Rachmonis says yes. Here, actually teaches the other way around. Chesed is lashpia l'kol gam shalei shayach l'Rachmonis. No, this has no discussion. B'nei she'ein chas klum, ve'ein she'ein chas klum. But I want to on the hand, I'm sorry, before I continue. On the other hand, another person to be shaykh. But I don't want to go into that deep right now. It's not so easy to discuss. The truth is not, it's not too different. And not the just a different aspect of Rachmanis. Continues what we discussed last week, and that's why big day that Moshe gets for begvonim that Sefiros Hashem beg that Savur began echad Sefiros. Okay, so we discussed the harmony, the connection, because it's chesed is pure giving, gvura is pure withholding. The Sefiros mumutza, so mumutza is another way of several colors. That's to make something beautiful. One color alone, you don't call Sefiros. Okay. So that's a continuation of what we spoke in the previous. The next section now he goes into Netzach and Heid. What is he going to say? Remember, we're talking about hashpah here. So chesed and gvura, chesed is power to give, gvura is power to hold, Sefiros is in between. It's a mix of the two. Now, in other words, this is chesed gvura kind of the giving, but really giving, like chesed small, be giving to everybody, even some that doesn't deserve, and is the discipline, and the Sefiros is profound. You know, let me just say this. So the fact that it says that even when chesed is saying the person is innocent or deserves, the prosecutor comes and gives a taina no, that's guilty. So chesed is not why we both keep so that is beautiful. thing. What he's talking about something else. He's talking about chesed, own. You know, if the person that doesn't deserve. Buddha balancing each other. Why? Because Buddha checks and says, no, the person doesn't deserve chesed. Chesed is just a give. Chassidus doesn't, when Chassidus has compassion for someone that's guilty, not saying give everybody. Obviously, if a person doesn't deserve to get hurt, like love, sport, even have time that comes chesed, we have rachman and a from din. Very different thing. Chesed here, essentially chesed could go to klipa. Sefiros doesn't say go to klipa. The forgiveness, when you keep forgiven for that's not the same thing as chesed just giving bli gvul. Chesed bli gvul means there's no cheshbon altogether. That's why gvura comes and checks it. You need the symptom of gvura. Sefiros says even though the person is guilty, you still nevertheless have rachmanis on him. That's essentially the reconciliation between these two interpretations. And Alter Rebbe here, he focuses more on the fact that Sefiros rachmanis is the mamutza, meaning it's the perfect blend between chesed and gvura. Now you can still ask, so what's the difference between gvura shebechesed and Sefiros? Gvura shebechesed does that. So that's a good question, and I've never seen a direct answer Chassidus on it. What I would say is that Gvura shebechesed is indeed, does check chesed and make sure that chesed is not just indiscretionary, meaning just giving without any cheshbonus. But Sefiros is the full-blown balance when you have the two. Like when you say, kosav ashlishi machriya beinehem, that's not Gvura shebechesed. That's a third party, a third rov, or a third member of the Bezdin that says, let me find the hachra between the two of you. And that's a whole different madrega. So it's a much deeper blend of chesed and gvura than just gvura shebechesed or chesed shebegvura. Okay, want to ask something?
Yeah, and the Kol Rachman says that chesed on itself only gives to somebody who deserves.
He's I believe so. The chesed itself, in other words, is like kazaka, like if that you find a good reason to give. And here he says chesed bli gvul.
So it seems like there is already a certain din.
Well, there he doesn't talk about gvura altogether, if I recall correctly. He just talks about chesed and rachamim. I would have to say, because the rachamim there is like rachmanis, let's say in bedin, let's say like Yom Kippur, that what he means that only deserve. In other words, if you only go with chesed, you can also say a person doesn't deserve, and therefore he shouldn't be. There should be no kapara for him on Yom Kippur, for example. I think that's what he means there. So Rachmanis comes into play and says that even if he doesn't deserve, meaning there's a reason not to give him chesed, you still forgive him. Here, when you say chesed bli gvul, here it sounds more like it's focusing on the element of chesed just flowing. In other words, it's a hashpah, like a teacher just giving without any hagbola. And it's not good for the makabel. You can't say then, Sefiros will come and say, give it anyway to the makabel. Reiv teva ein yichem lakabel. So that's what I think he's saying here. That's why it's not talking about the same, when you say deserve. He doesn't mean bli gvul here, that even give to someone that doesn't deserve. He means bli gvul here, giving without any hagbola. That's what it appears to be the... You can look further into it, but that's how I always understood it. Okay? Good. So now comes the next part. The next part is a very vital component, because this is probably, again, one of the few places you really see it spelled out, in Tanya. So what's the role of Netzach Yisayt? Chesed, Gvura, Sefiros seems to cover everything. Chesed is Hashpah, Gvura is Hagbola, or Tzimtzum, and Sefiros is the mix. So no, he makes the key next line is like this. Now, this hashpah is all how the mashpia prepares himself. So the mashpia needs to have chesed, needs to have gvura. Let's think of a rav and a talmud, and he needs to Sefiros, the mix. Now comes the actual hashpah lidei maisa, the hainu b'shasa hashpah mamish, Now it's coming to the exact art of actually being mashpia. You have, for example, I know this sounds strange, but there are people who can train mashpim and train teachers, but they're not good teachers. I remember when someone telling me, Lahavdil, in a case of, he was going to an acting school, and he said the main teacher that teaches acting is brilliant, and one day he tried to be an actor himself to show, and he was like, they were all laughing. It was a joke, he couldn't act well, but he taught them brilliantly. In other words, he was great at the concept and the theory, but in Peil Mamish, he wasn't the best person to actually do it. So you could have someone who can be a trainer of teachers and give all the rules properly, like how much chesed, how much gvura, how much to say, how much not to say in a good shir or a good class or a good lecture, but they themselves not necessarily know how to do it. I mean, without mentioning names, I remember Rabbi telling us about a certain individual, he could be masbir an inyan to somebody that he himself doesn't understand. So there's that concept too. Now, is it the other way around too? Can you have someone who's good at teaching and doesn't know the theory? Obviously you're good, because some people have skill they're good communicators, and they may not know the rules of how you communicate well. So what he's saying here is like this, that now you need another set of tools, which Chesed Gvura Teferes is the essential theory, which means without that you don't have hashpah altogether. You need hashpah, you need Chesed bli gvul hashpah. You need Gvura to be, like the Lashon here, to be letzamtzim, or shalei lashpia, and Teferes is the mizug, the balance. So now he says, now you need lidei maisa. You have to bring the hashpah lidei maisa, the hainu b'shas hashpah mamish. So during the actual hashpah, you also need, there's also an art to that. So here, what do you need to do? Tzarich li'yisayitz eich la'ashpia b'derech sheyuchel ha'makabel l'kabel hashpah. So you need to get advice. Li'yisayitz means here internally, which means you need to have discretion, or you need to consult, or to strategize, I would say, how to be mashpia in a way that the makabel could receive the hashpah. So Chesed, Gvura, Teferes are the essential. You can think of them as the main instruments that you use. But now you have to actually implement it, and here you need a new set of tools. Kagoin, and the Alter Rebbe continues. Like, for example, Shereitzel Ashpiyah Devar Chochmeh Lelamda Lebnei. Wants to be mashpia, some wisdom to teach his child. If the father will say it to his child, to say everything that he knows to his child, the way it is besichle, lo yuchal ben lahavin or lekabel, the child will not be able to understand and receive. It will be overwhelm him. It's like giving too much. Rak shetzorech lasadele beseder ve'inyan acher, beseder ve'inyan acher, yadaber dibur alefanov. He has to organize it in a seder. What are you going to say first? Aleph, Beis, Gimel, an orderly fashion. Ma'at, slowly, like spoon-feed it, so to speak. And that is now something that is not included in Chesed Gvura Teferes. He says, and this, B'chinas Eitzazu, Nikras Netzach V'Heid. Shehem Kleis Yeyitzes. This is called Netzach and Heid. So let's understand what this means. L'cheira, isn't that the role of Gvura? He said before that Gvura is l'tzamtzim ha'ashpah. L'tzamtzim ha'ashpiyah. Oy shalei ha'ashpiyah. So if you look at the diuk, he doesn't say that tzimtzim in the hashpah. He says l'tzamtzim ha'ashpiyah. In other words, Gvura makes its general decision of how much to give, whether to be mashpiyah or not to be l'tzamtzim ha'ashpiyah. In other words, to diminish the actual hashpah, or not to be mashpiyah altogether. But it doesn't say that Gvura necessarily breaks it down into a step-by-step plan. For example, when teachers create a curriculum, they create a syllabus, which is a plan by plan. What are they going to teach week 1, week 2, week 3? So even though you could say Gvura has a role in it in general, but this is a very specific plan. You could have Gvura, which is a general rule that so-called limits the flow, which is obviously has something in common, because he does say that if he just says everything, it will overwhelm the student, but it doesn't necessarily include the whole details of actually sitting down and planning it out step by step. So essentially, Netzach Heid, and truth is also Yesod, but let's talk about Netzach Heid, is really, in that context, almost like a subset of the first Midas. And that's what it says in some places, that they are not, that the main Midas is Chesed, Gvura, Tiferes. But when you talk about how these Midas are actualized, it's Netzach Heid Yesod. So sometimes Netzach Heid Yesod actually is in place of Chesed, Gvura, Tiferes. Which is interesting. I don't know if this is a beer. This, I don't, again, I've never seen this. But when we say that Rabbi by the Ushpizin, we skip Netzach Chesed Gvura Tiferes. It goes that the Alter Rebbe's Chochmah, the Magid and the Baal Shem Tov, the Magid, the Keser, Atik and Arich, Alter Rebbe's Chochmah, the Mittler Rebbe Bina, the Tzemach Tzedek Das, and the Rebbe Marash, you think next would be Chesed. And no, it skips to Netzach. The Rebbe Marash is Netzach, the Rebbe Rashab Heid, the Frierdiker Rebbe Yesod, and the Rebbe we consider Malchus. What happened to Chesed Gvura Tiferes? It's like skipping. So, I don't know if I've ever heard this or my own thoughts, I don't even remember. That may, perhaps you could say is because the Rabbeim are not just the theoretical midas, they're also meant to actualize it. In other words, to bring it down b'shas hashpah. That's what a Rebbe is. So perhaps Chesed Gvura Tiferes is maybe the Yesod, but the actual implementation is Netzach Heid Yesod and ultimately Malchus. Maybe. But B'kitzur, the bottom line is, here it's clear from the Alter Rebbe that the Netzach and Heid's role is the next stage of the Hashpah, using again, B'shas Hashpah Mamish, Tzorich Liyisayis. So he's talking about B'boy Hashpah Lidei Maisa. Chesed Gvura Tiferes, technically, doesn't come Lidei Maisa. You could have, theoretically, a Mashpia wants to be Mashpia, and there's Gvura, and there's Tiferes, and there's no actual Hashpah. Or like I said before, he may not even be a good Mashpia in reality, in action. That's not necessarily the case, but it could be the case. So Netzach and Heid is what he calls Kleis Yetzes. Now what's that? Kleis are the kidneys. And Yetzes is like the consulting kidneys. They're like the two consultants. So this is based on, first of all, Chazal say it, but it's based also on Sefer Yetzirah, that the different body parts correspond to different midas. So for example, when we say midas shebelev, now everyone takes for granted, you open up a heart, you're not going to find midas in there. Instead, you open up a brain, you're not going to find necessarily intelligence, you can't see it. But everybody understands that the brain generates intelligence. So what's really the relationship between midas and a heart, and a physical heart? Is it more beremez? Is it just correspond to? You know, is it, or the heart actually produces midas? In other words, God forbid, if a person has a heart attack, their midas won't work so well. I mean, they definitely will, it'll cause their functioning, but did the midas get compromised? Like, in other words, we know there's a concept of timtum alev, but is that a physical heart, or is that more of the so-called spiritual component of it? So again, I've never seen this discussed anywhere directly, but they definitely correspond with each other. Now, same thing with the kidneys. Chazal used the word yeyetzes and kloyes. Now, kloyes are the kidneys. Kidneys, technically speaking, biologically speaking, essentially filter the blood, that clean out the blood and allow it to be and remove the waste when a person expels the waste. So his kidneys have to do with yeyetzes. However, because every part of the body corresponds to different so-called features or faculties, so we say that the kleis are connected to that. Now, there is more ancient medicine where it actually talks about, like in acupuncture or other things, Chinese medicine, where they talk about how if you put certain things in the kidneys, it actually affects a person's personality. So maybe there's connection to that as well. But regardless, at the minimum, it corresponds to at least beremes. So kleis yeyetzes, but then he goes on to say, which I'll read, might as well read it. Then he compares it also to the gam trein bein, the testicles. Hamavashlim azera shehi atipa nimsheches ma'amoyach. So essentially, he compares now the two kidneys to the two testicles, which essentially cleanse the same idea, mavashlim. They purify the zera, the seed, that comes from moyach ha'av, like we already learned earlier in Perek Beis in Tanya. So what does that mean here in this context? Just like it is physically, the same thing it is psychologically and emotionally. That hainu dvar chochma v'seichel animshech meseichel ha'av, shelo yimshech k'moi shehu seichel tak ma'ed b'meichi v'sichli, rak yishtanek tzas medaku sichli v'yisav v'seichel she'ena dak kol kach, k'dei sheyuchel haben lekabel b'meichi v'avanose. So in other words, what he said earlier, the role of the yeyetzes, which means that you need to use a strategy that doesn't just mashpia, but how exactly you're going to communicate to the student or to the child. So that's in the physical sense of it, that's what the kidneys and that's what the testicles do, that they dilute so-called the seichel, that it shouldn't come b'dakus in the pure subtlety the way it is in its source, but rather that it should come down in a way that the yuchal haben lekabel b'mecha v'noseh v'hu mamish al derech moshel ketipa yeredes ma'ameach shidaka ma'id v'nasis gasa v'chumnis mamish b'kloyes v'trein bein. So mamish, the physical, is similar to the way it is in ruchnius, that just as it is in the physical body, that what kidneys do and what the bein do are to cleanse, so to speak, and to filter, is maybe the best word, to filter, so too Netzach and Heid filter the hashpah, that it should come the feet measured exactly towards the makabel. And that's okay. Then he goes on and says that Netzach and Heid are also compared to Schokim B'Rechaim, Shesech Mimal Tzadikim. Essentially, another way, it's another way of another description of how it filters and cleanses. Al derech moshel shemefarer hachitim lechalokim dakim ma'ed. Like when you take grain and you break it down to small parts, kach tzorech ha'av lahaktin haseichel v'dvar chochmeh, so too the father has to minimize or diminish the seichel and the wisdom shereitz lashpia lebnoi ulechalkim lechalokim rabim, and break it down into many details or parts. V'lei melei ma'at ma'at b'moyetzeis v'das. And say it to him slowly, which requires its own wisdom, its own strategy, so to speak. So the Alter Rebbe essentially here, about Netzach v'Heid, Chesed Gvurat Tiferes is maybe 6 lines. And Netzach v'Heid is a whole page description, here in Tanya itself. But then he continues, it's not over. Then he says like this, another thing about Netzach in Hashpah, in addition to it being, because in this case we're talking Netzach and Heid are 2 partners. And Netzach come together, the 2 kidneys, the 2 bein, they are together, they do this job. Without really breaking down what is Netzach's role and what is Heid's role. So the Alter Rebbe now continues and explains what's the difference between Netzach and Heid. So just for the record, it's interesting to point out, talking about Netzach and Heid, so it says in Kabbalah, Svarim, the Rebbe brings it in a number of places, remember Tov Shalamed Hey, and in later years as well, it wasn't so common that it says in Svarim, in Kabbalah Svarim, not Rizal, I think it's Kamfeyena and a few other places, that Purim, Chanukah and Purim are connected Netzach and Heid. Shala also brings it. But here's the interesting thing. It says, but they don't know which one is Netzach, which one is Heid. That's what it says in the Svarim. So the Rebbe, interestingly, once said that that the Rambam, there's a famous discussion, did the Rambam know Kabbalah or not? So there's 3 opinions. Some say he knew Kabbalah, but it was not his inyan to be Megalit, so he doesn't really talk about it. He only hints to it in a few places. The Ragachover, in one place about Cyrus, brings it. Some say he didn't know Kabbalah, and that was that. And some say he knew, but at the end of his days, they revealed to him Kabbalah. It's brought in the Sichos of the Frierdiker Rebbe. The Rebbe has an Oris on this. Different opinions. But the Rebbe brought, according to the opinion that the Rambam didn't know Kabbalah, you could explain now why, strange thing, in Rambam, Hilchas Chanukah and Purim are part of one halacha. It doesn't start. L'cheira, why would Hilchas Purim begin, or Hilchas Megillah begin as, Hilchas Chanukah begin as a Hemshech to Hilchas Megillah, it goes to Hemshech HaPrakim. It should begin from Perek Aleph, and it's not like that. I think there's 4, I'm not forget how many chapters there are in Hilchas Megillah, and then it continues to Hilchas Chanukah. So the Rebbe said that perhaps it's because Chanukah and Purim are Netzach and Heid, and therefore they come together. And in Yedei, me. So there's different opinions which one's Netzach and Heid. So you see from that Netzach and Heid have a certain, partnership, like twins. Like here, like 2 kidneys. You need them both, and they both to join together. Now the Alter Rebbe continues and explains the difference now. He says, V'gam, b'chal b'chinas Netzach, another thing that's included in Netzach, hu l'natseach olamid neged kol mineya ha'ashpa v'alimud mebnei mebayis u'machutz. So he introduces Netzach, the actual word. What does Netzach mean? Till now, Netzach means Netzach. It means to be victorious, to win a battle. Midas HaNetzach. What we spoke about till now, where you see Netzach is not Midas HaNetzach, and it's Midas HaEitzah. It's about eitzes. It's about strategy, together with Hoid. But now he teaches Netzach, it also includes to stand up and to vanquish and to be victorious over anything that tries to stop the hashpah and the limud mibnei, whether it's a challenge from within, mebayis or mebachutz. So this is just in generally an interesting piece, because who would want to stop a father from teaching his child? So we understand this doesn't necessarily mean a physical person stopping. It could be, but any maniyah. It could be an argument, it could be a conflict, it could be a klippah, whatever it may be. So Midas HaNetzach is necessary in Hashpah because in case there's any challenge in the Hashpah, so Chesed, Gvura, Tiferes are not enough. You need something to fight. There's like a fighting element where a father will fight to be mashpiyah to his child. Which of course Hashpah here doesn't just mean learning, he means also to protect the child. So that's Midas HaNetzach, how the Alter Rebbe teaches it here. And he teaches Mebayis, Hainu Lischazik Neged Midas HaGvura V'Atzimtzum Sheba'av Atzmei. He actually does teach this, I didn't remember that. Okay. So he teaches now Mebayis, does he also teach Mechutz? Let me see. I don't think he teaches Chutz, and actually in the parentheses it says B'ksav Yad Nirshim Choser. So it looks like there's a few lines missing, because the Alter Rebbe only teaches Mebayis, but he doesn't teach what he means Umechutz. So what means Mebayis? What miniyah could there be within the home, which means within the father and within the family, that should stop the hashpah? So he says, Hainu, Lischazik Neged Midas HaGvura V'Atzimtzum Sheba'av Atzmei. The father could have Midas HaGvura V'Atzimtzum, and for whatever reason, doesn't want to be mashpiyah. Shima Eireres Dinim B'Ritzein El B'nei. Leima She'ein Roi L'Kach Hadayim. The father could be judgmental, or in any other way find himself dinim, judgment, being judgmental, and therefore being angry, so to speak, at his son, that he's not yet worthy for me to be mashpiyah to him. So this alone, you could probably create a whole therapy session for parents and children. What he says here, that why would a father have such a gvura? So comes Midas HaNetzach and overpowers and says no. Even if there's a maniyah bin bayis, which means the Midas HaGvura, and he brings Midas HaGvura again, that the father decides this child is not worthy yet to be mashpiyah on him, to so Netzach comes and counters that and fights that he would be mashpiyah. So essentially the conclusion of this would be that a father should not allow himself to be judgmental of his child. He should invoke Midas HaNetzach to make sure that he is mashpiyah. And that's what Netzach is. So this is a whole different role of Netzach. This is not the role of Netzach and Heid as in Kleis Yeh says, advice, or the method of how to teach, step by step, ma'at ma'at. But here we're talking about the sheer power, the sheer willpower and determination and tenacity that a parent has to have, a father has to have, and not allow his own gevura, mebayis, should be a maniyah. Now, as I said, right after that, it says, B'ksav Yad Nirshim Choser, which would mean that we don't have here, what about what's mechutz? What would be a challenge from outside? You could assume, and I really have to look up on maybe some of the commentaries on Tanya here, because Shiurim B'Sefer Tanya or others maybe refer to some places in Chassidus that may fill in this with missing piece. You know, we assume that Tzemach Tzedek may do it, but I don't recall it. I'll look that up. I'll let you know what I find. But B'chutz, you would assume then would mean that it's not coming from the father from within, it's coming from someone else that's causing so-called a kitrug or a gvura that wouldn't allow, that would want to stop the hashpah. In other words, an outside influence. But he doesn't give an example, so we can't assume exactly what it may be. The interesting thing is, after that, he also doesn't talk about hoid. So it could be what's chassid here is not just the second half of Mebayis and Mechutz, but also what Hoyd is, because only says only Netzach here. Now, it could be the Alter Rebbe doesn't have anything more to say about Hoyd. He already said it. But it would make more sense that he'd probably have something to say about Hoyd, because the next line is B'chinas Yesod. He jumps straight to Yesod. So since we're not discussing Hoyd yet, we'll get to Hoyd and we'll talk about what the role of Hoyd is in Hashpah, besides the Kleis Yetzes, the what we talked about here. So let me talk now more about this Midas HaNetzach. Now this second component in Netzach, everybody's familiar with, because if you learn Basar Legani, it's a whole section of Basar Legani, the second half, talks about Midas HaNetzach. So there's Arichas Gdela there. So let's talk about Netzach from that context. So, like I did in the previous Sefiros and all the previous classes in this series, we'll talk about how it is L'mayla, how it is L'mata in Adam, and of course what it means in Avedis Hashem, and Mayin Afkamina in the whole picture, and what it means in Avedis Hashem. So let's start what it is, L'mayla and L'mata, based on Basar Legani, which is very much just really an extension of what it says here. Here he's talking strictly or generally about Hashpah. But what does he say in Basar Legani? So we all know what he says there. That Oitzer, there he talks about that the Hemshech in Basar Legani, the three meanings in Sova. He talks to Yisrael, the Bnei Yisrael, when they left Mitzrayim, were called Tzivus Hashem, Tzivus Havaya, and Sova has three meanings. And one of the meanings is, what's the third meaning, is there's Zman, there's that, is it the Eitzer Shenikra, huh? Right, that's the third one, Yefi. But then he says that's the level of Eitzer, right? That's the treasures. What is the treasures? So he says that we see, the mashal he gives, that you see that a melech, a king, only when there's a Midas HaNetzach will he reveal and be mevazbez kol ha'eitzes. He'll splurge all his treasures, even those that were completely hidden and concealed in his coffers, in his internal vaults, that were saved for generations. But when it comes to Netzach, he reveals the deepest keiches. Why? Because Midas HaNetzach reaches be'etz shedish be'etzem ha'nefesh. That's the lashon more or less there. Higher than all other midas. And then the nimshal is what is the Netzach is Eitzer L'mayla, and he brings L'mayla Aden Ketz, L'mata Aden Tachlis, is the deepest dargis that go all the way up Helam Acha Helam L'mayla, and that becomes Nizgala when a Eid comes down L'mata to fight the war with the Nefesh Habamis and Gufa Nefesh Habamis to transform the Midas, the Ruach Shtus to L'umazet, the Ruach Shtus to Kedusha. So to fight this battle, the Eibishter gives the Anshe Tzova, which means the simple Jews down here on earth, the front line soldiers, he gives them the deepest Keiches L'mayla. And that's the Eitzer, and that's what Netzach is. So in other words, in Elam Esal Yenim, in Atzilus, where Lakus is Begole, or in Gan Eden, you don't need the Eitzers, because you can fight the battle, or if there is a battle, or there's no battle altogether. It's Dafke the Menagid that brings out the Midas HaNetzach to that, and that alone is what's Megal, the deepest levels of L'mayla. And the Sava Kodesh Baruch Hu Li'is Le'is Baruch Dira B'Tachtenim, and Tachtenim requires a Mochama, because Tachtenim on their own is a Helen Behestes, Cheshach Kofel Mechupel. So you need to have Keiches to transform that, and that Dafke touches the Etzem all the way to L'mayla. That's the essential Nukudah there. In other words, it's not that you need the Eitzes to win the war. That's one thing. You give Tachsisi Mochami, you give weapons, you give resources to your soldiers. That's every war. But Eitzes has to touch something deeper. The Melech has to feel that he's on the line here. Like he says there, that he's ready to even give his life. So he gives his deepest keiches in order to win. Now what exactly is this? When you hear it for the first time, it sounds even strange a bit. So what is that? There's some anatzchonis, midas anatzchonis, chaz v'sholom. The Eibush has to win. You know, some people have that, they must win. And they're like sore losers. And they can't stand not winning. So therefore they'll do anything to win. We see some of the worst things come out of that. In history, people who had that midah, wasn't always such a beautiful midah. So what does it mean? And here it's all talked about l'mal yusa, not l'gri yusa. What does this mean exactly? So there's a lot of different explanations for it. In Chelik Vov L'Kutei Sichos Shmos, the second famous sikh about Taimei Abriya. So there he says that all the reasons for creation all have a shleimus in them. So they can't really be reasons for atzmus, who's l'mayla from l'mayla metam v'das. So for example, the Gala shleimus kechesav is one of the reasons given, Eitz Chaim, that the Eibishter wanted to reveal his potential. So that's a good reason, but it's a good reason for Atzilus. To say that Atzmus needs to reveal his potential. No, Chassidus says, Ein koyach chaser peil. Why does the Eibishter need it? He's complete without that. He needs to express himself. So it's a reason, like the Rebbe explains in Seder Shtalshus, but it's not the ultimate reason. Then there's the reason, begin the Ishtamuden Bey, in order that he be known, that there be Kalim that receive him. Yakir Kirug Dulose. That too has a mile. It's like a teacher who teaches. Why? Because he wants the student to appreciate it. It's not just to him reveal his faculties. But that too is a reason. So ultimately the Rebbe says there, and it's based on Maimorim and Ayin Beis, that the famous story, expression from the Alter Rebbe, Nisava Kosh Baruch is an Atzmus. Why Lama Nisava, why did he have a taiva? Afatayv Nishtak in Kasha. What does that mean? The concept of a question and an answer, Seichel, wasn't created yet. Atzmus creates Seichel. So how could you ask a question why Atzmus created Seichel or why Atzmus does something? So it's L'mayla, it's touching Etzem alone. So the question that we ask, why did he want that did it b'tachtenim? So the Alter Rebbe explains in Tanya, Perek Lamed Vov, because that's Nesava. Not because of a shleimus. Not because of the shleimus of Gilead, not the shleimus of Kabbalas HaMakablim, of Kalim. That's what the Eibishter wants. What did he want? That in a world of Klippas and Sitracha, there should be the Shvira. In other words, the Midas HaNetzach is connected to this Taiva and Atzmus. That doesn't have a reason. Lamata, you could say there's an inyan of Midas HaNetzchonis, a person wants to win because he wants to, for ego purposes. A king doesn't want to lose. He wants to show that he's for his pride or for his covet or for that others should be afraid of him. He can't afford to lose. Lamaila, you can't say that. So Lamaila, you have to say it just touches the deepest part of him. And Lamata is a muscle to understand it. We look at the Midas HaNetzachim of a melech who needs to win. Now, there he brings there with the Talmud, I'm sure it's there, the Talmud Chacham is Nekim V'Neter for his covet. I think he brings it in that in, maybe not. Maybe I'm mixing two things. But regardless, obviously, he's talking about it in a form of Kedusha. Are there kings in history that had a Midas HaNetzachim for the wrong reason? Of course. I don't want to say all the names of people that all they wanted was to win. And even though you can maybe use that a little as a mashal, but there it's not coming from Kedusha. It's coming from pure arrogance. Like when you say Haman, or others that wanted to be victorious. Here we're obviously looking for a mashal in the Kedusha, a melech that is driven l'shem shamayim, and he wants to win for the Eibishter's sake. So the point is that Netzach is a midah given to each of us that is rooted in the midas HaNetzach and l'mayla, that when there's a menagid, it brings out the biggest keiches. Essentially, the keich of Mesiras Nefesh, as he explains in Bosaligani, that can only be elicited when there's a menagid. When you see the Eden in Russia, or throughout history of Mesiras Nefesh, and we know Mesiras Nefesh is no greater expression of Kiddush Hashem, it's only possible when there's a menagid. What does it reveal? Like Alter Rebbe says in Tanya, again, in Perek Yud Ches and Yud, that even a Kal Shebakalim, if he knows that his very essence is on the line, he'll have Mesiras Nefesh. Doesn't mean because there's no Giluyim, it reveals the Etzem HaNefesh. An example that we all use for it is a simple one. God forbid, if someone in your family, Chmona Litzlan, is in danger, there's an emergency, what happens? Suddenly you have strengths that you never had before. You dig as deep as you can, not because you want to. It's not even with a plan. It's just the challenge, the emergency just elicits something inside of a person that you just cannot fabricate. You can't fake it. You can't simulate it. It's the sakana shebedover that brings out such deeper keiches, both a deeper strengths, and so on and so forth. So what you see is that if you take, it's always good, as I've pointed out, to let's say what happens if a person didn't have Midas HaNetzach, or there was no Midas HaNetzach in the Maila, no Netzach in the Sefiros. Let's say it skipped from Teferes to Haid, or there was a different midah. What you would lack is the ability to go all the way to the etzem of Elokus and to the etzem also na Adam. So even though we talked about Teferes is Mavriach min HaKotza LaKotza, and it goes all the way up to Keser and all the way up to Teferes HaNelam before the Tzimtzum, but that's still all Giluyim at the end of the day. Etzem here is higher than Giluyim, like he explains in Basaligani, Lamai Lamala Aden Ketz, he says Helam Acha Helam. Lamata Mata Aden Tachlis, he says, is Gili Acha Gili, the Elikuz that comes down all the way Bislapshus, all the way down below. Lamai Lamada Aden Ketz, he says Helam Acha Helam, basically the Helam Atzmi of Elikuz. So there now we're talking about how the Eibishter transcends Giluyim. And that's Midas HaNetzach. From all the Sefiros, Netzach reaches the deepest etzem part. Now obviously we know that's not enough. You also want to have Giluyim. You know, on Gilia Atzmus. That's why we need Teferes and we need other Sefiros. But this component of Netzach that we're talking about, Midas HaNetzachin, is the component of reaching the essence of someone. And that's essentially when we say, like I said, when a person is in sakana, or a person is being threatened, they're very yadus. When a person goes on Mesiras Nefesh, Rabbi Akiva said that his whole life he was waiting to be becoming this mitzvah. Story of the Beis Yosef that Rebbe brings from the Magid Masharim, that Mesiras Nefesh is that highest thing, but it only comes when there's a menagid, because there's no reason to be Mesiras Nefesh without that. Now, can you have Mesiras Nefesh, Mesiras HaRotzen, even without a menagid? You could, but it's much harder. A menagid elicits that. So that's the general role of Netzach, and it really continues from what the Alter Rebbe said here. We read in Geras HaKedesh. Just one final point. I never saw this as well, but maybe if some of you want to do homework. Is there a connection between the Yoyetzes of Netzach as advice in how to be mashpia and the Midas HaNetzach? In Tanya, it doesn't sound like there's a connection because he says, like a nuin, v'gam b'chlal b'chinas netzach hu l'natzeach. But he does say b'chlal b'chinas netzach. So you could say it means b'chlal in the mid of netzach, the b'china, the level of netzach. Lav dafka, that this netzachin is part of how to be mashpia, because what's the connection? How to be mashpia, the pratim, even if there's no menagid. So just an interesting thought. So maybe a separate thing, and that's fine too. You know, Netzach can have has many roles. Netzach, the Eibishter made things have different roles and functions. So I didn't finish the discussion on Netzach. We'll continue next year, but at least covered the first big important part of it.